Hi there. Today I'm doing a brake fluid bleed. I've recently replaced the pads in this rear caliper here, so it's good practice just to bleed the system through. Also, my master cylinder here has got like a bit of a spongy feeling on the pedal when I depress the pedal. That may be because that there might be some air trapped in the system, or it may be that the master cylinder is on its way out. Bike's done 44,000 miles, so it could be the master cylinder on its way out, but obviously first things first, do a fluid bleed. So really important just to make sure you've got everything to hand ready before you start this job, because you don't want fluid just spewing out everywhere. Brake fluid is very corrosive for paintwork, plastics, people, so wear gloves. You want a container to collect the old fluid in as you're bleeding through the system. You want some new brake fluid. Most bikes is .4. Ideally, you need to know, well, you definitely need to know the history of your brake fluid. So ideally what you would do is have a new bottle, but because I'm always working on bikes, I tend to get the big bottles. I know the history of it, I know that there's no contaminants in there, I know the top's always been done up and it has been stored correctly. It's not too old, it's maybe 6 months old. Brake fluid is hydrophilic, so it takes on water, and that's why you really should bleed your brakes with an absolute maximum every 2 years. Ideally, I would say do it as part of an annual service. It's dead easy to do, and it does improve the braking capacity of your bike as well. It's a lot more responsive, and in turn it helps your safety. So brake fluid, being as it's very corrosive, what I do is cover everything where it might drip out. I get it all covered with old rags, in this case an old desktop. And I really don't know what that rag was. This bike is an R1200gs and it's non-ABS model. ABS brake fluid bleeding is quite different to non-ABS. So this is basically the procedure for any non-ABS bike. I personally don't have ABS bikes because I think they're a faff, and certainly the older BMW ABS servo assisted systems are kind of well known to being a bit rubbish. So it's better that if I'm going to buy an older bike, I'd rather just not have the ABS on it. I've never had ABS on a bike actually. So it's kind of really simple to keep on top of the servicing of the brakes as well. So other things you might need an array of spanners. Generally speaking, these bleed nipples here, if I remove the dust cap, there's the bleed nipple, and these bleed nipples here are generally 8mm or 10mm. So this is an 8mm and fits perfectly. I know this anyway. And I've also got a ring ratchet spanner, and these are great. You can actually have it over and then it just spins either way to do up or undo. Great sets these are. Oh, this one is also got an angleable head, which is really good for getting around tight corners and things. When you're bleeding the reservoir, try not to ever let it go below the minimum mark, and that's with it up in this horizontal position. Additionally, if you can, put the bike on a centre stand or prop it up against the wall safely to have it upright. And as you're bleeding it, just be very careful that it's not sucking air into the system going below minimum. If you open this up really quickly, it can spew out like very quickly. It's also going to be under some pressure with me pushing down on the brake lever, not too far, but just pressurising the system enough that if there is air bubbles in there, it's hopefully going to force it out of, say, like maybe you might get some stuck here in the master cylinder. Generally where there's little corners and kinks, you could get the air bubbles building up. I mean, this is quite a straightforward system, so it's coming up out of here. That could be an area where air bubbles get caught up in. So this sort of U-bend up here and then down along here. So there's a few places where it could get caught up, but it's certainly not as convoluted as some other systems that I've worked on. So I'm gonna just check up here, open up the reservoir, and I will actually just give this a few pumps just to pressurise the system before I even get down here to the bleed nipple. There's plenty of fluid in there at the moment. I'm quite happy that I can start bleeding it without having to put any fresh fluid in at the moment. But what I'm going to do is give the brake lever a few pumps just to pressurise the system, and watch what's going on up in here, because there may be some air bubbles even that are trapped in here that can escape upwards before I even open this nipple up here. Now I've pressed the brake lever a few times, and I'm happy that there's no air bubbles coming up through there. The liquid's quite clear. It actually looks quite clean. When I bought the bike, I did actually bleed the brakes, because there's something I do when I buy a new vehicle. Always do an oil change, always do a filter change, always bleed the brakes, check the actual quality of the brake pads and so on. So I'm going to go ahead now and open up this bleed nipple. I'm going to put the ratchet on in undo mode and pop this on. Good airtight fit. This pipe needs to be quite clear so you can see if there's any air bubbles coming through it. This one's actually starting to go a bit milky, so I do need to get a new pipe soon. Just gonna get it open. See how I'm holding on with this so it doesn't pop off. I only want to do it a little bit at a time, because suddenly once it releases it will go, and I think that is close to release stage. I'm just going to put a bit of pressure on this rear brake lever now. probably a bit difficult for you to see here, but there is some fluid just here. So what I did is I've loosened it off, and I've pressured the system, loosened it off. There's no air bubbles in here at all, and what I will be doing is just loosen it off, bleed, press, bleed, and just keep doing that. Okay, so there's a few more little bubbles coming out of here now, so it could be indicative of some trapped air actually in the caliper here. There's a few more bubbles come out. They're not massive bubbles, but you think if they all gather up together, creating one big sort of air pocket, that's quite a lot of pressure that you're losing out on there. Just going to let that settle for a minute and just check the fluid level here. Top tip to help pouring, you can make a hole here and then just slice a little hole at the top, and then you don't have to take the whole lid off and spill fluid everywhere. So now I can feel that this rear brake pad is getting a lot firmer to press down, which is great news. It means the system is pressurising. There's still only some tiny bubbles that are coming out. They're probably maybe a mil in size, 1 millimetre if that. It's actually started coming down through into the bottle as well now. So this whole thing, one thing you have to be careful of is any back pressure coming back up into the system and then forcing any air bubbles back into the system through this way. And that's why when I depress the lever, I open it and then I let off, and at the same time as letting off the lever, I close it, and by closing it, it's stopping any air bubbles or any contaminated fluids going back into the system. Now I'm just going to check the reservoir.
think about it. Right, folks?
Thanks, but I don't think winning's gonna help me at all.
And why not?
Because she came here with me.
When you're doing this nipple up, don't do it too tightly or else it can shear off. I've done that before. And torque wise it's probably only maybe 8. I'm not even sure if it says in the manual. I'll check that out. So it is just enough to pinch it closed, don't yank it closed, and always just keep an eye on it that it's not leaking once you have done the work on it. The level is probably about 2mm under maximum there. I'm perfectly happy with that. That will also give me a chance to keep an eye on things. Give everything a good wipe. I use these Wilco cleaning wipes. I find they're really good degreasants and really cheap as well. Make sure you dispose of any old brake fluid in an appropriate manner. Just have a visual inspection that there's no leaks or anything, either from the reservoir down here at the nipple, even at the master cylinder, because you've just put a lot of pressure through the master cylinder. If there's any rubbers or anything that are perishing, it might be now that it's more noticeable that you've got weaknesses in the system. It's a good chance just maybe to have a little visual check of other things like brake pads, discs, tyres, so on, any other fixings. And when you take it for the first few rides, just be very careful. Don't put too much pressure on the braking system, and if anything you might want to just feather that back brake, or alternatively if it's the front brakes, just until you are sure that it is gripping and biting and working properly. Don't go, for instance, herring it late for work and putting everything into it thinking that it's going to work. I wouldn't trust it to do that. I'd always want to do a couple of test rides first before I start really angling on the pressure through the system. So that's about it. Thanks for watching.